Okay, I think with that point, I'm going to open it up to you. So we have at least a good 30 minutes for questions from you. Please just, the mic, someone will pass you a mic. Put your question, first tell us who you are, just very quickly, and I know a number of you will want to put questions, so please put your question as succinctly as possible. Thank you. Here, there's in the front here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Adrian DiGiovanni. I work with IDRC on law and development issues. And first of all, thank you for a really great presentation. Your idea of the predatory center really rang true for me in many ways. And, you know, working in the region, some of the things we've been trying to do now in East Africa is look at, and I have a strong interest in looking at administrative law. And the organizations and researchers we've been engaging with really put it within a democracy framework on the idea and administrative law is what governs everyday decision-making and use of public authority, and the idea that it's not just elections, but the sort of everyday decisions and use of bureaucratic public discretion that really matter in democracy to promotion. It's just one part of a larger equation, but really I feel in seeing your graphs, there's another chicken and egg that comes up, and so I'd like to get your reactions. Is it, you know, are we going to have sort of fair, predictable, equitable, legal decision-making once the center expands, or is this a way to bridge and make the center sort of more into the yellow? I mean, we're going to hopefully try to find examples where that happens, but I would just like to get your sense of how that fits into your larger...
You want to answer that?
Yeah, you know, I said to someone the other day that state building, and I think, Rita, you made the point, state building has to go hand in hand with nation building. State building is the administrative part you're talking about. It's a technocratic approach. It's necessary. It's easy. It's easy because you can build mechanisms. You have frameworks. You can do all of those things. Nation building is very, very much more tricky. And it requires good visionary leadership in the first instance. That's what I think. Nelson Mandela, for example, did a hell of a lot in South Africa for nation building. And you have to have that in place. Now, unfortunately, when you're dealing with a scarcity of resources or concentration of resources, you're dealing with a global paradigm today where consumption is the mantra of the day for everybody. We're all into a consumer culture. You know, just walk into the shopping malls. It's consume, consume, consume. So when you're in that kind of situation, it's very hard to get leadership that is thinking, you know, more broadly. And, you know, it's a natural kind of thing when, you know, people are faced with scarcity, they'll go to conflict. You know, I went down to the south of Sweden to a place that is supposed to be one of the most innovative places, and I said to the Swedes, you know, I'd like to go and see this community. So I went to visit them and to try to understand what led to this huge innovation in this tiny community and the cooperation. And what it was a very, very neat social compact between the private sector and labor based on the church, the Lutheran church, and the fact that the owners went to the same church as the employees, and so they felt very guilty if the employees were poor, and they were, you know, so there was that kind of close-knit community, but an absolutely peaceful community. So driving with my Swedish colleague, I said, you know, Mats, assume that this community is cut off by some major catastrophe, like an earthquake or something like that. Now they've got 30 days of provisions. What do you think will happen on the 29th day? For the last bit of provisions that are left, do you think they're going to be so peaceful and share that with each other? Or do you think that they're going to violently try to get those resources for themselves? I don't know what our human nature is all about. But what I do know is when they had this Sandy thing in New York, and I saw on CNN, because I don't know now, CNN is dramatizing everything, you see, You know, people were rushing for candles in a store. I don't know if you saw that on TV. And they were basically just falling over each other and pushing each other and grabbing those candles. These are people who have economic prosperity. But faced with a crisis of a shortage of candles, which they needed, they were ready to kill each other. Well, not kill each other, but they were ready to punch each other just to get to the candles.
Having lived in Denmark, the answer to your Swedish problem, because it's in the south and close to Denmark, on the 29th day, they just go to Denmark and raid them for provisions, which is what they've been doing to each other for 500 years. But let's get some more questions, please. Yes. There's a microphone here, please.
Barbara Darling, your presentation was fascinating and the discussion following. I particularly found your power maps very well presented. There were a couple of areas that I wonder if you have explored further in the power maps. You don't show the external sector and its influence and its relationship in terms of power levels. And you don't go into showing the role of the individual and society in relation to these sectors. I mean, consumers are powerful people. Voters can be. But also, you don't show what's happening above the table and below the table. And particularly for your core, your center core, that would be, I think, very helpful to understand in its relationship with the outer core. Because I think that's what we're sometimes talking about. The other dimension that I'd be interested in your reaction to, I think and it's been touched on in the discussion, but I think it's very important to unpack phrases like political development, social development, economic development, security development into steps, gradations. I mean, the difference between security of the body or food security or candle security is quite different from the level of development that a human rights security suggests. And the interplay across these different levels of development can be quite profound. So at what point does economic decline, for example, cause the other sectors or the progress made in the other areas to be lost, to be thrown out? And at what point is a society able to cope with that? And also, how ethnicity overlays all this, or identity overlays this. Because, as you said, Rita, it can be instrumentalized so easily. It's a powerful tool, but at some point, other factors, I mean, certainly inequities can be tolerated for a long period, but at another point they explode. Just some thoughts.
Vasu, and I think Rita might want to come in on this too.
Yeah, Barbara, you stole my punchline on the first question, so I'll answer the first question when I come to the punchline. But on the second one of segmentation, you know, this is a criticism a lot of people in the South have with a predominant focus on human rights and justice, which focuses on, again, human rights. And people say, why not economic justice? Why do you just focus on social justice? Why not, and you want to hold people, you know, and I had this debate in New York a few months ago with our colleagues in the United Nations. I said, look, it's a wonderful thing that we got the ICC. Personally, I support the ICC. I think it's a wonderful mechanism. I said, what about us establishing like an international criminal court to bring perpetrators for genocide and others to the court? What about also establishing an international economic court for justice? So that CEOs who are complicit in corruption, like the CEO of Halliburton in the US, where they paid a $200 million fine for bribes to the tune of $6 billion in Nigeria. Now, that's an admission. I'm a lawyer. That's an admission of guilt. So that man should be in the Economic Court of Justice. And just like the other guys they put in jail in The Hague, they should put that CEO in jail also. Because the consequences of that corruption is poverty and death to some people also. That's the problem with segmentation.
Rita, do you want to comment?
Just quickly, I think in terms of sequencing and prioritizing different rights, I think my argument would be very strongly that the way in which democracy has been promoted in Africa alongside a particular kind of economic policy that also prioritizes reductions of government spending and so forth has meant that it was very difficult for African governments throughout the 1990s when the transitions took place to actually respond to economic demands, to respond to social demands, which meant that there was only one economic policy to choose from, which meant that when political parties were competing, they couldn't compete on economic policies because there was only one model. It made it much more tempting to mobilize and instrumentalize ethnicity because that was one way in which you could differentiate yourself. And I think in that sense, the model of democracy that was exported to Africa has a lot to answer for in terms of the results that we've seen. It's not coincidental.
Okay. Just maybe on the court idea, of course, the International Criminal Court, the good news is there are economic crimes of war, plunder, pillage, complicity by means of encouraging others who commit abuses, that corporations can't be held accountable. The court can only, but the court can hold individuals, and the court has not pursued formal investigations, but has certainly looked in a number of cases at the potential complicity of economic actors in some of these crimes. It'll take a long time to get to what you're thinking about, but just as a point of information. Yes, please, here in the front.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion and presentation. My name is Michael Urban, and I have one brief comment and then a question. The first comment is, I think it's, and I'm sure I'm just preaching to the choir here, but I think it's very important that we are very careful when talking about pluralism, that we say what we mean. I mean, pluralism can mean three different things as far as I can tell. It could mean essentially just a reflection of a reality. We have a number of different ethnic groups in a country. It can mean an ideology, a commitment to sort of fairness and equality amongst those groups, or it can mean an actual policy package which accepts one as a reality and seeks to solve that or manage that reality with number two. So I think it's just important because we've talked about the breakdown of pluralism without really even discussing what we mean by pluralism in the first place. And I think that recognizing that an ideology about pluralism is an important part of the answer is an important part of what we're talking about, is an important part of solving the problems where we see this breakdown. My actual question is, it seems to me that we haven't really depoliticized ethnicity in a lot of advanced countries. What we've done is we've domesticated it. We've removed violence from it. I mean, I don't think you can talk about Canadian politics without not talking about ethnicity. I mean, we had a referendum in '95, which was, despite the thinking of some, had a great deal to do with ethnicity at its root.
Quebec independence.
And so I'm wondering, is the question not so much a question of, well, do we want to do we have to decide between a route between democracy and development to pluralism? Is it more a question of how do we domesticate ethnicity? Not how do we depoliticize it, but how do we render political competition between ethnic groups nonviolent?
Okay, maybe Rita, you first on that one.
Okay, it's a good question, obviously. It's a very tricky question to answer in that I think there isn't a general answer to you. I think in the African context, 2 points. Oftentimes, ethnic groups have their own modes of holding people to account, right? They have their own ways of dealing with difference and problems and conflict resolutions that are with those groups, right? And they have held their leaders to account over time and so forth. And I think that is part of what has been lost when we're looking at these issues in a contemporary African setting. Whether or not there are ways of building on those in Africa, I think, is an issue that many of us have been thinking about. Are there ways of designing democracies that can make use of the differences like you're suggesting? So far, I think it's fair to say that Africa has not made much progress on that. And those of us who are not placed on the continent always feel slightly hesitant to come up with the proposed solutions if the starting point is that maybe those that have come from the outside have been part of the problem in the first place. But I think you're right in identifying the problem. But it's not an easy one to answer, and I certainly don't have one good answer to you on that.
I wonder if South Africa might be an example where race or ethnicity is very political, but yet successfully to now has been nonviolent. It's in the post-1994 era, at least at the macro level. Would you read it that way?
I mean, I think, Michael, I share your perspective, and it's an interesting perspective. I obviously want to reflect a little bit on it, but it is an interesting perspective that you raised. Now, in South Africa, we've managed to deal with racial and ethnic identity partially through the nation-building project, and partially through some of the instruments we've put in place, the constitutional instruments, all the rest of it, devolution of power. Now comes the crux, because now we have to deal with redistribution of income in South Africa. 95% of the stock market in South Africa is white-controlled. The disparity in income has actually increased. So white wealth in South Africa, since the demise of apartheid, has actually increased tenfold. These are the issues, the economic issues, that are threatening the nation-building project. So, and that's why somehow we keep coming back to this question of economic development and the spread of prosperity. And Michael, that's probably the answer, is that you can domesticate it, provided people feel a sense of belonging once, and they can only feel a sense of belonging if they are beneficiaries of the prosperity.
Okay, good. Other questions, please? Comments? Next to Michael.
Thank you. Is it on? Kevin English. I'm also from the policy shop over at Foreign Affairs and International Trade. My question for you really, really succinctly is Africa in the 21st century, resource curse or resource blessing?
Resource curse or resource blessing?
It's a blessed curse. Well, we hope it won't be a curse. We hope that we can appeal to the global community and to our own leaders to act responsibly in the utilization of what are national resources and not personal resources.
Okay, I said at the beginning I wanted to come back to this issue of private investment, particularly in the extractive sector, which you both alluded to. Do you want to answer that and also think about the question, because in the Canadian context, Vasu, there's been a real effort on behalf of our development agency to say that much more linking Canada's involvement aid projects to also private sector projects in the extractive sector, public-private partnerships, etc. And this is a current debate here. So I don't know if, Rita, you wanted to comment on that. You evaded the question a bit, saying, we need it if it's done right, but are you worried about it? And Rita, I know you study this as well. What are the risks?
I've promised myself always to be very careful what I say about Canada in public, being new to the country, so I'm going to consider my words very, very carefully.
They're nice people, eh?
Very nice people, and they let me into their country, so I have to behave myself. I don't think resources are necessarily going to be a curse at all in Africa, but I'm also slightly worried about everyone thinking that resources is all there is to Africa. And I think we have to ask ourselves very seriously why so many countries at the moment are talking about resources all the time. The risk is that we let our foreign policies towards Africa be driven by our self-interests and our own geopolitical interests rather than the interests of Africa. And I put that out there as in the most general of terms. But I think it's a serious issue. It's also important to remember that there are many countries in Africa that do not have resources and that are experiencing also high growth rates, right? Ethiopia being, for example, one of them. So not everything that is happening in Africa has got to do with resources. I'm worried also that we are being misled by the easy temptation that resources are the source of conflict. I think resources often keep conflicts going, but they're not causing them, right? And I think one big misunderstanding out there at the moment in relation to the DRC, for example, is that it is a cause of the conflict. It's the means in which rebels can get to fight, but it's not the cause of the conflict. If we want to end the conflicts, we got to look at other things, particularly in the DRC at the moment. There are more low-level, local conflicts that are keeping this going. Resources is such a nice, easy, seductive narrative, right? It gives us an easy solution to stuff, and it makes us think that if I only don't buy that mobile phone, I'm helping, right? But conflict isn't that easy. And I have worries about the way everything is centering around resources at the moment. But I do think that if we look just very quickly, for example, at a country like Ghana, I think the chances are pretty high that Ghana is going to get away with this without suffering the so-called resource curse. Pretty high.
Good, that's an optimistic note. Again on this, particularly on the extractive sector, but broadly on private economic actors and their impact for good or ill on conflict, ethnic conflict in Africa. I mean, one of the issues here is that you spoke of inequalities. You've stressed this repeatedly. Presumably, it's all about getting the wealth created by this distributed equally. I mean, that presumably is the answer. But where are you concerned that won't happen? Do you have particular? You've worked in Madagascar, for example. You've worked in DRC. You've worked elsewhere.
Yeah, look, it's not that I'm concerned that it won't happen. The reality is it's not happening. In Sudan, for example, the reality is that people have benefited personally from the oil resources. And the companies who are extracting oil are complicit in that, because they know that that's what's happening. And the countries from which those companies come have their own domestic legislation, but they won't utilize it. So there's a chain of complicity. So Sudan, the DRC is, it's a known fact of the utilization of those resources. I think on a smaller scale, even donor assistance, which is part of the resource revenue of countries, is in many ways redistributed in a convoluted arrangement with governments and clients and everybody else. And this is something that's going on. Now, I share Rita's view that it's not the cause of the conflict. There are deeper structural issues in a society that we have to get right, but they are key exacerbating factors. So to deal with M23 in Eastern Congo, without the incentive for resolution there, but the incentive for continuing the conflict because people are personally benefiting, this is very difficult. How to bring those conflicts to an end. And I can tell you that for somebody, who is trying to mediate and assisting in this, is very, very frustrating. It's very frustrating when you get to these countries and you see, nice gentlemen like this in jeans and coats and shirts with their bags waiting to meet with government officials. And you know that there's stuff going on under the table. And you know that is driving a lot of what keeps people in the center, and they don't want to leave power because, this is what is happening. And so this is a problem that we can't solve only in Africa. Yeah, and I'll give you a quick example, David. We had a project with the Norwegians in Burundi, and we were discussing with the government. It was to deal with land mediation, which is what we're doing, and the Norwegian government was funding it. And just before we could implement the project, the Norwegian colleague who was on the ground, a good friend of mine, she said, "We can't do this project. We can't give you the funding." And I said, "But why?" She said, "Because you're working with the government." I said, "But we have to work with the government because they have the land commission." And she says, "No, but the government is corrupt." I said, "Well, how are we going to do this?" She said, "No, there's corruption." So I said, "Look, man, this is coming directly from the president's office. So, because we were involved in the conflict and we have this relationship with the presidency, I said, let's arrange a meeting with the president, and you and I will go and we'll talk to him about this problem." So we went. And Pippi, my friend from Norway, was sitting there. And I said, "Pippi, why don't you explain to the president what your problem is on the corruption?" So she sat there and she said, and the president said, "Please, madam, tell me what the problem is." So she went on and gave a long list of issues on corruption. Then the president said, "Are you finished?" She said, "Yes." And he said, "Madam, even if I took you and put you to sit here to run this country, you're not going to be able to deal with that problem of corruption." He said, "You know why?" He said, "Do you know what I pay my ministers?" She said, "No." He said, $300 a month. Okay, that might shock most of you. Mm-hmm. But that was Rita's point about the imposition of economic frameworks. Because he then said, it's not because I want to pay them $300, because the World Bank says we have to pay them $300. Okay? That's the first point. Then the second point, he said, "You see now, madam, we want to buy a helicopter." So I don't deal with that. It's a Ministry of Defense prerogative. So the Minister of Defense has to deal with the purchase of the helicopter. Now he says, look, there are 3 countries who want to sell this helicopter to us. I'm not going to tell you which 3 countries, but I can tell you that except for South Africa, no other African country is producing helicopters. But I know that there are many. I don't know, do you produce helicopters?
I don't know.
Yeah. But your neighbors produce helicopters, and the Germans
I know we
and the
can hardly
Swedes
afford new ones.
The Germans and the Swedes and everybody produce helicopters. So he said, "Madam, you see, now there are 3 countries who want to sell helicopters to us. So they come to my minister, and one says, we can do this for you, and the other one says, we can do this for you, and the other one says, we can do this for you personally." He said, when the minister then produces in a cabinet meeting the proposal of which company in a certain country we should buy the helicopter from, I would never know that he got a house built in some country for him personally. He said, this is the problem that we're dealing with all the time. And the point he was making to her was, you also have to clean up your house. Now, is this fiction? It's not, because that Tony Blair stopped the investigation into the sale of arms to the Middle East because British Aerospace put $1 billion or $1 million into Cayman Island accounts. And when they asked for the investigation, he said it's a matter of national security. It's documented. I didn't say that. It was written in their papers.
Okay.
So it's not fiction.
Okay, we've got the responsibility of outsiders, and you've turned the telescope around on us. And we looked in, and now you're looking out, and I think that's quite appropriate.